Hey guys, tonight we're going to be gliding through one of humanity's most timeless disasters: cheating, infidelity, adultery, whatever you want to call it. It's been around for as long as people have been pairing up, swearing loyalty, and then immediately breaking that promise. Because apparently, even in the Middle Ages, even with all the plagues and famines and weird dental hygiene situations going on, people still had the energy to sneak around. So, dim the lights, pull the blanket up, and let's take a nice long walk through history's awkward bedroom politics. We'll see how different societies dealt with cheating, from ancient laws that made it punishable by death, to more casual royal scandals where everyone just politely pretended not to notice. Along the way, expect a few depressing kings, some very bitter queens, and a whole bunch of side eyes from the church. And remember, this isn't going to be some action-packed, scandal-shouting documentary. No, this is the Sleepy Lane. We're floating through stories of broken vows, slow-motion dynastic drama, and the eternal truth that humans have always been a little messy when it comes to relationships. Let's start with the ancient world, because why not go straight back a few thousand years, when clay tablets were the equivalent of Facebook messages. In ancient Mesopotamia, we're talking Hammurabi's Code, that famous list of do this, Dan, T, do that laws from around 1750 BCE. Adultery was treated with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. If a married woman was caught with another man, both of them could legally be drowned. Romantic, right? The logic was simple. Wives were considered extensions of property, and their behavior reflected directly on the husband's honor. Meanwhile, if the husband was wandering around with other women, let's just say the law suddenly looked the other way. Classic double standard. Now, here's the fun part. If the husband wanted, he could choose to pardon his wife and her lover, saving them both from the whole drowning situation. So technically, forgiveness was an option. But I'm guessing those forgiven dinners were pretty awkward. Imagine being at the family table, passing the goat stew, while remembering that just last week, you were tied up on the riverbank with a rock around your neck. Cozy. Slide over to ancient Egypt, and things get a little more spicy, because they weren't quite as rigid. Adultery was still a major offense, sure, but punishments varied. A common penalty was mutilation, like chopping off the nose of an adulterous woman, which really was the ancient equivalent of posting scarlet letter across someone's forehead. But here's the twist. Love affairs also show up in Egyptian love poetry, which means while the state was busy punishing infidelity, people were also secretly writing mushy little verses about forbidden passion. Humans really can't help themselves. And of course, when we get to the pharaohs, things blur even more. Because the royal household wasn't just about romance. It was about bloodlines, politics, and, unfortunately, a whole lot of inbreeding. When your sister is also your wife, and your cousin is also your mistress, the entire idea of cheating starts to look more like a complicated family reunion chart. Cleopatra herself had enough tangled relationships with her brothers, generals, and Roman lovers that calling anything cheating feels almost pointless. At that level of dynasty drama, it's just Tuesday. But let's drift gently west to ancient Greece. Now here's where things get interesting. For the average Athenian woman, adultery was a one-way ticket to disaster. If a wife was caught cheating, her husband had the legal right to kick her out immediately. No second chances. No dramatic reconciliation speeches. Out you go. Meanwhile, Greek men, let's just say their rules were different. Male citizens were free to visit prostitutes, or to take on courtesans, or even to have affairs with male lovers. And society basically shrugged. The only real taboo was sleeping with another citizen's wife, because that crossed into property theft. Again, notice the pattern. It wasn't about love, or emotions, or heartbreak. It was about ownership. Still, Cheating in Greece wasn't always treated with quiet paperwork. There's one famous law from Draco. Yes, the guy whose name gave us the word draconian, which said that if you caught someone in the act with your wife, you were legally allowed to kill him on the spot. No trial, no jury, just surprise execution. Imagine explaining that to your friends later. Oh yeah, Callias. He's not around anymore. Caught him in the wrong bed. Anyway, past the olives. Rome, predictably, cranked things up another notch. The Romans were obsessed with appearances. Adultery wasn't just a personal failing. It was a political one. Under Emperor Augustus, adultery became an actual crime. Wives caught cheating could be exiled to remote islands, which sounds like a vacation until you realize the island had no servants, no wine shipments, and no way off. Husbands were also required to divorce unfaithful wives, or else they could be punished themselves for tolerating immorality. Because in Rome, image mattered more than actual happiness. Of course, that didn't stop the emperors themselves from constantly breaking their own rules. Augustus, the guy who passed the adultery law, he had affairs of his own, naturally. Tiberius basically gave up and moved to Capri, surrounding himself with young companions. And then you have Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius, who was so notorious for her affairs that later historians claimed she once entered a contest with a prostitute to see who could sleep with the most men in one night. Spoiler, according to the story, Messalina won. Now, is that exaggerated slander? Almost definitely. But the fact that Romans found it believable tells you all you need to know about her reputation. Let's float gently now into the medieval era. Because if the Romans were hypocritical, the medieval church was creative. By the Middle Ages in Europe, marriage had become firmly tied to Christianity, which meant cheating was no longer just a social scandal. It was a sin. And sins, as always, came with a menu of punishments. For ordinary peasants, getting caught in adultery could mean public humiliation, like being paraded through town, sometimes literally tied together with the person you cheated with. Which, I'll be honest, feels more like an awkward trust exercise than a punishment. In France and Germany, adulterous women sometimes had their hair cut off as a symbol of shame. In England, fines were common. But here's the strange twist. Punishments were wildly inconsistent. A nobleman might escape with nothing more than a stern letter from the bishop, while a poor farmer's wife could face brutal consequences for the exact same thing. Class privilege, still undefeated, even in the bedroom. Now, medieval kings, well, they took do as I say, not as I do. To Olympic levels, cheating wasn't even cheating when kings did it. Everyone just sort of accepted that kings would have mistresses. In fact, some royal mistresses became powerful figures in their own right, handing out favors and shaping politics. Charles II of England practically filled half the aristocracy with his illegitimate children. The joke was that it was harder to find a noble without royal blood than with it. Queens, however, had no such luxury. An unfaithful queen could bring down dynasties, because if she had a child, no one could be sure if it was the king's or the lover's. And that uncertainty was dangerous, which is why accusations of adultery against queens were sometimes more about politics than reality. Take Anne Boleyn. Officially, she was executed for adultery, among other things. In reality, it was probably just Henry VIII being bored and wanting a new wife. Romantic, right? But let's not leave out the everyday romances. Because while kings and queens were busy with their palace scandals, ordinary villagers were just trying to survive love triangles without losing their crops. In some parts of medieval Europe, local courts handled adultery cases like they handled disputes over cows or fences. Testimonies, fines, occasional beatings, and then everyone went back to arguing about grain prices. Adultery wasn't glamorous, it was paperwork. Yet, we do get some fascinating glimpses into how people really felt. Court records show husbands begging for their wives to be forgiven, wives asking for mercy after being seduced, neighbors tattling on each other just to stir drama. Human emotions preserved on parchment, showing that heartbreak and betrayal were just as raw then as now, only with a lot more mud involved. Now, before we drift further into Renaissance scandals, let's take a soft pause here. We've already seen people drowned in Mesopotamia, noses chopped off in Egypt, Athenians pulling out swords, Romans exiling wives, and medieval peasants tied together for the village to laugh at. Quite a track record for something that, let's be honest, people never really stopped doing anyway. So, take a slow breath, adjust your pillow, because in part 2, we'll slide into the Renaissance and early modern era, where cheating got even more tangled with power, and where the courts of Europe basically turned adultery into both an art form and a political weapon. Alright, so, let's keep floating. We're leaving behind the mud-soaked medieval villages, and we're gliding into the Renaissance and early modern world. Picture brighter paintings, silk sleeves, powdered wigs just starting to appear on the horizon, and somehow even more scandal. Because if there's one thing royal courts were good at, it was mixing politics with messy love lives. Now, the Renaissance loved to present itself as the age of art, poetry, and lofty ideals. Courtly love, chivalry, knights writing sonnets for their ladies. But under all those flowery metaphors, yep, plenty of affairs. Because behind the embroidered curtains, human behavior hadn't actually changed much since Mesopotamia. People were still sneaking into each other's chambers, and then scrambling to invent excuses. Let's start in Italy, because of course, Italy, the Renaissance, was basically born there. And along with it came a parade of families whose love lives were as tangled as their power struggles. The Borgias, for example, the famous clan that everyone accused of poisoning their rivals. Pope Alexander VI, real name Rodrigo Borgia, had multiple mistresses while also being, the Pope. His daughter, Lucretia, was married off 3 times for political gain, and every single one of those marriages came with whisper campaigns about supposed affairs. Sometimes she was accused of cheating, sometimes her husbands were, sometimes both. And because gossip spreads faster than plague in Renaissance courts, people started throwing in accusations of incest just for extra spice. Of course, historians today argue that Lucretia probably wasn't the femme fatale she was painted as, more like a pawn in her father and brother's schemes. But you know how rumors work. One courtier makes a sarcastic comment, another writes it down. And 5 centuries later, we're still talking about it. Now, let's slide north into France. French courts had a special flair for adultery. They practically institutionalized it. By the 1500s and 1600s, having a royal mistress wasn't just common, it was expected. A king without one looked weird, almost suspiciously devoted. Francis I had mistresses. Henry II famously fell for Diane de Poitiers, who was actually 20 years older than him, which in itself broke all the stereotypes. She wielded enormous influence for decades. Catherine de Medici, his wife, had to just live with it. Which, to be fair, Catherine had other hobbies, like orchestrating terrifying religious wars. Louis XIV, the Sun King, basically turned mistresses into a second government branch. He had a whole series of them, each one carefully balanced against the others, so that no single family gained too much influence. And while his wife, Maria Theresa of Spain, officially endured it, courtiers treated the mistresses as legitimate players in politics. So technically, cheating was still wrong, but if you were king, it was also just another tool in the royal arsenal, like cannons, or taxes, or wigs the size of small carriages. For noblewomen, though, completely different rules. An unfaithful wife could face exile to a convent, a forced annulment, or just disappearance from court life. The double standard didn't just survive the Renaissance, it thrived. Now, let's float over to England. Because honestly, English monarchs could fill a whole playlist on this topic. Henry VIII is the obvious star here, though he technically preferred annulments and executions to just shrugging and letting his wives have fun. Still, adultery was at the center of several of his marital breakups. Anne Boleyn's alleged affairs led to her downfall. Historians debate whether those charges were real or cooked up by enemies. Spoiler, probably cooked up. But Henry needed an excuse to get rid of her, and adultery was the ultimate political weapon. Accuse a queen of cheating, and suddenly every child she bore was suspect. That was enough to justify chopping off her head. Convenient. Then there's Charles II, a century later. Completely different vibe. Charles openly acknowledged his mistresses. Dozens of them. He gave them titles, land, pensions. Nell Gwyn, one of the most famous, was a literal actress from the stage, and when he fathered illegitimate children, which he did a lot, he made sure they were well provided for. In some ways, Charles almost normalized adultery, to the point of it being a side hobby of the monarchy. The court thrived on it. Gossip papers thrived on it, and Charles seemed perfectly content. Speaking of gossip, this was the age when printing presses started spitting out pamphlets and tabloids, which meant that suddenly, cheating scandals weren't just whispered in court corridors. They were sold on the street for a penny a copy. Imagine being the Duchess of so-and-so, trying to have breakfast, and someone hands you a pamphlet with your husband's latest mistress printed in woodcut illustrations. Not exactly the peaceful, married life. In some cases, these pamphlets destroyed reputations. Adultery went from private sin to public spectacle. Everyone could have an opinion, and once your scandal went to print, good luck putting that toothpaste back in the tube. Now, while we're still floating through the 16th and 17th centuries, let's not forget the ordinary folks. Because while kings and queens were staging political soap operas, normal couples were also cheating, but with much less glamour. Local court records from Renaissance towns are filled with adultery trials. Sometimes they read like tragic melodramas, a wife seduced by a neighbor, a husband caught visiting a tavern wench. But sometimes they read like comedy sketches. One case in Italy describes a woman accused of adultery because she and her supposed lover were seen laughing together too much. Another case in England involved a man accused of sneaking into his mistress's house disguised as a woman. Spoiler, the disguise fooled absolutely no one. Punishments varied. Fines, shaming rituals, occasional imprisonment. And in deeply religious towns, you might get sentenced to public repentance. Standing barefoot in church, confessing your sins to the whole community, which, if nothing else, probably killed the mood for any future affairs. But let's drift gently into the 18th century, where things got even more theatrical. Because by then, Europe had developed entire subcultures around affairs. Court society practically encouraged flirtation, as long as you kept up appearances. The French salons were famous for witty exchanges, and behind those witty exchanges were often very real relationships. Marriage was increasingly seen as a contract for wealth and status, while love, inconvenient, impractical love, was pursued elsewhere. Take Louis XV of France. His mistress roster was so extensive that he literally built a secret apartment network at Versailles to shuttle them in and out. One of his favorites, Madame de Pompadour, was more than just a mistress. She was his confidant, political advisor, and cultural trendsetter. Again, cheating wasn't just tolerated at court. It was practically expected. Contrast that with ordinary society, though, and you see the split. In England, adultery among the gentry could still spark lawsuits. Husbands could actually sue their wives, lovers, for damages in what was called a criminal conversation case. Yes, that was the legal term. Imagine being dragged into court and the lawyer accusing you of criminal conversation, which sounds like you just talked too loudly during dinner. But no, it meant adultery, with financial penalties attached. Now, across the Atlantic, things were stricter. In the Puritan colonies of early America, adultery was not just a sin. It was a scarlet letter, literally. Public shaming, whippings, and in extreme cases, even executions. Though by the 1700s, executions for adultery were rare. The stigma was intense. Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel, The Scarlet Letter, was based on this Puritan obsession with purity and punishment. Hester Prynne might be fictional, but the humiliation she endured had real historical roots. Meanwhile, in Catholic Spain and Italy, the Church's influence meant adultery cases could lead to Inquisition trials. Adultery wasn't always punished with death, but the fear of being dragged before church officials for moral failings was real. And let's be honest, having a bunch of stern priests grill you about your private life sounds almost worse than any fine. And of course, we can't forget the irony, because while ordinary people faced shame, fines, and legal headaches, the elites kept doing whatever they wanted. By the late 18th century, cheating scandals among royalty were practically front-page news. Marie Antoinette, for example, was constantly accused of infidelity, though much of it was probably propaganda. She supposedly had affairs with everyone from Swedish counts to her female friends. Were those rumors true? Hard to say. But pamphleteers ate it up, painting her as a frivolous, unfaithful queen while conveniently ignoring Louis XVI's own awkwardness in the bedroom. The hypocrisy was staggering, but also very on brand for history. Kings could cheat and be admired. Queens could be faithful and still get accused. And peasants, they just hoped no one noticed them sneaking out at night. So, let's pause again. Take a slow breath. We've floated from Renaissance Italy to French courts, English lawsuits, Puritan America, and Versailles secret hallways. And everywhere we look, cheating isn't just a personal issue. It's political, it's social, it's sometimes life or death. In part 3, we'll keep gliding forward into the 19th century, the Victorians, and the wild contradictions of a society that preached morality while secretly building entire industries around scandal. Okay, so let's gently step into the 19th century. This is the age of trains, telegraphs, industrial smoke, and people wearing more layers of clothing than a modern-day IKEA display mannequin. The Victorians especially were famous for presenting themselves as the guardians of morality, purity, and stiff upper-lip seriousness. And yet, surprise, cheating didn't exactly go away. It just got covered in lace doilies, euphemisms, and legal paperwork. Victorian society loved appearances. On the outside, a proper gentleman was supposed to be devoted to his wife, raise respectable children, and attend church. A proper lady was expected to embody modesty, chastity, and the ability to faint at the sight of an exposed ankle. But behind closed doors, the reality was less saintly. Let's start with the men. A Victorian husband had enormous social power. Divorce was still extremely difficult to obtain, especially for women. In England before 1857, you couldn't even go to a civil court for divorce. You had to petition Parliament. Imagine trying to get your marriage annulled and having to drag your whole sad story in front of a bunch of MPs who'd rather be drinking port. For men, adultery was technically frowned upon, but it rarely ruined them. In fact, many men regularly visited prostitutes, and the Victorians knew it. London was filled with brothels. By some estimates, there were tens of thousands of women in the sex trade during Queen Victoria's reign. Guides like Harris' List of Covent Garden Ladies circulated in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Essentially Yelp reviews of prostitutes, complete with descriptions of their specialties. Imagine opening one of those pocketbooks by candlelight and reading, Miss So-and-so, aged 19, known for her lively conversation, romantic. Now, for women, the rules were brutal. If a wife cheated, the scandal could ruin her life. Families might cut her off, society would gossip endlessly, and she risked losing her children. When divorce finally became possible through civil courts in 1857, the double standard was baked right into the law. A husband could divorce his wife for adultery alone. But for a wife to divorce her husband, she had to prove adultery plus another offense: cruelty, desertion, or incest. Because apparently, one broken vow wasn't enough. The courts called it matrimonial causes, but in practice, it was often public shaming. Newspapers gleefully printed the dirt from high-profile divorce trials, turning private betrayals into soap operas for the masses. Ordinary people bought these papers the way modern folks scroll gossip sites, shaking their heads, pretending to be morally outraged, while secretly enjoying every detail. Of course, hypocrisy was everywhere. Queen Victoria herself was deeply devoted to Prince Albert, which made her an outlier. Their marriage was famously affectionate, but outside the palace, Victorian elites weren't always so squeaky clean. Affairs, mistresses, and secret liaisons were common, just kept quieter. Well, quieter until someone slipped up, and then the tabloids feasted. Take Lord Byron a little earlier, in the Regency era. Technically not Victorian, but his legacy spilled right into it. Byron's affairs were legendary. He was rumored to have had lovers across Europe, including half the aristocracy, and possibly his own half-sister. Gossip about Byron was so scandalous that polite society tried to exile him. But at the same time, everyone read his poetry and whispered about him at dinner parties. By the time Victoria took the throne, Byron was long gone, but the template of the scandalous aristocrat had been set. Let's float into France again for a moment, because the French always add flair. In the 19th century, Paris was both the city of romance and the city of endless affairs. Writers like Balzac and Zola captured it perfectly in their novels. Adultery wasn't just a personal problem. It was a literary theme. Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary told the story of a provincial woman bored in her marriage, chasing passion through affairs, only to meet tragic consequences. Society pretended to be shocked. Secretly, everyone recognized the story. And of course, the French had their political scandals. Napoleon III, nephew of the original Napoleon, had a string of mistresses that were barely hidden. His wife, Empress, put up with it in public, but privately, it was another story. She was devoutly Catholic, horrified by his behavior, and sometimes retreated from public life altogether. But because Napoleon III was emperor, everyone else just shrugged. Once again, the rules bent for men in crowns. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic in America, things were mixed. The 19th century in the U.S. was shaped by Protestant morality, especially the Puritan echo that still lingered in New England. Adultery was condemned harshly in sermons and newspapers. But the reality, human nature kept doing its thing. One of the biggest shifts was in divorce law. In some American states, adultery was grounds for divorce much earlier than in England. But the stigma remained heavy. A divorced woman might be socially ruined, struggling to remarry, or even to maintain friendships. A divorced man, however, might shrug it off, remarry, and keep his career intact. Again, double standards everywhere. Now, let's drift into the psychological side. Because Victorians didn't just punish adultery, they analyzed it. Well, at least the emerging class of doctors and social thinkers did. Early psychology loved to frame unfaithfulness as a symptom of hysteria, nervous disorders, or moral weakness. Women, especially, were seen as vulnerable to temptation because of their supposedly unstable emotions. Men, on the other hand, were framed as naturally lustful, so their affairs were excused as biology. Convenient science, as always. And then there's the medicalization of sexuality itself. By the late 19th century, writers like Richard von Kraftebing were publishing thick volumes like Psychopathia, Sexualist, cataloging every possible deviation. Adultery wasn't just a sin anymore. It was a case study, which sounds clinical. But really, it was just Victorian men writing down their anxieties in Latin to make them sound important. But here's where things get really ironic. Because, while Victorians preached chastity and loyalty, they were also building a huge underground of vice industries. Brothels, sex workers, and even elaborate secret clubs thrived. One notorious London club, the Cannibal Club, mixed intellectual debate with scandalous behavior. Elsewhere, gentlemen's clubs provided discreet spaces for affairs. All of this was happening while Parliament debated morality laws. Even in literature, you see the split. Anna Karenina, Tess of the D'Urberville, Madame Bovary. Novels about women who cheat, or are suspected of cheating, and who end up punished or destroyed. The message was clear. Don't stray, or you'll suffer. But the very popularity of those novels shows how fascinated society was with the idea. It's the same energy as people tutting over tabloids today while buying every issue. Of course, not everyone accepted the hypocrisy. By the late 19th century, feminists began challenging the double standards. Writers like Mary Wollstonecraft earlier had already argued for women's rights in relationships. But now campaigners like Josephine Butler fought against laws that punished women in the sex trade while ignoring men's responsibility. Slowly, very slowly, the idea that women's fidelity should be policed more harshly than men has started to face resistance. But let's zoom out for a moment. The 19th century didn't actually invent new patterns around cheating. It just dressed up the old ones in corsets and long sermons. Men still got away with affairs. Women still faced ruin. The wealthy still bent the rules. The poor still endured harsh punishment. The main difference was the layer of moral theater piled on top. Victorians loved to say one thing and do another, which, honestly, makes them sound not so different from us. So, take a slow breath. We've wandered through smoky Victorian cities, French novels, scandalous courts, and endless moral hypocrisy. Humans kept cheating, society kept pretending to be shocked, and life, as always, went on. So, let's drift now into the 20th century. The lights are electric, the cars are rumbling down new roads, and suddenly people have more freedom to move, talk, and meet than ever before. And with that freedom came a new wave of infidelity stories. This time splashed across newspapers, silver screens, and eventually, television sets. If the Victorians wrapped adultery in lace and sermons, the 20th century wrapped it in Hollywood spotlights and paparazzi flashbulbs. Let's start right there. Hollywood. The film industry exploded in the early 1900s. And along with it came a steady stream of affairs, scandals, and whispered rumors. Actors and actresses lived in the public eye, and audiences were fascinated by their private lives. Of course, the studios worked hard to cover up anything too messy. In the 1920s and 30s, Hollywood had fixers whose whole job was to make scandals disappear. An actress caught in an affair with a married actor quietly moved to another studio, or sent on a vacation until the gossip cooled. A star found in a compromising situation, papers were paid off, reporters were distracted, and official stories were invented. But sometimes, scandals slipped through. Clark Gable, the king of Hollywood charm, had multiple affairs, including one with co-star Loretta Young. which resulted in a child. To avoid scandal, the child was secretly adopted and only acknowledged decades later. Everyone in Hollywood knew, of course, but the public pretended not to notice, at least until much later. Then you have Elizabeth Taylor, who became almost as famous for her marriages and affairs as for her acting. She married 8 times, often to men she had affairs with before leaving her previous husbands. When she took Eddie Fisher from Debbie Reynolds in the late 1950s, the press had a field day. Debbie was America's sweetheart, Eddie was her husband, and suddenly Liz swept in. But here's the twist. Despite the outrage, Taylor's career didn't die. If anything, it made her more iconic. For women in ordinary life, cheating could still mean social ruin. But for Hollywood stars, it sometimes just meant bigger headlines. Now, shift over to politics. Because nothing mixes worse than politicians and affairs. Unless you count politicians trying to cover them up. In the early 20th century, some scandals were whispered about but kept off the front page. Warren G. Harding, President of the United States in the 1920s, had multiple affairs. One mistress, Nan Britton, even claimed he fathered her child in the White House closet. At the time, her book about it was dismissed as trashy gossip. Only decades later did DNA testing confirm she'd been telling the truth. So yes, one of America's presidents was literally sneaking into coat closets for quick affairs. Dignified. By mid-century, though, things got louder. John F. Kennedy is probably the most famous modern example. His affairs were legendary. With movie stars, with socialites, even with women connected to organized crime. The press in the 1960s largely looked the other way, maintaining a gentleman's agreement not to embarrass the presidency. Imagine that now. Today, an affair would be front-page news within hours. But in Kennedy's day, it was treated like an open secret, whispered about but not published. Of course, after his death, the stories poured out, and his reputation shifted from golden boy to complicated legend. And then there's Bill Clinton. The 1990s took political adultery into the 24-hour news cycle. His affair with Monica Lewinsky wasn't just a personal scandal. It became a constitutional crisis. With impeachment hearings and endless late-night jokes, the sheer scale of media coverage made it impossible for anyone to pretend affairs were private anymore. Suddenly, infidelity wasn't just a bedroom issue. It was a global headline, dissected in real time. But while celebrities and politicians grabbed attention, ordinary people were quietly living through the same changes. Divorce laws loosened across much of the world in the 20th century. In the U.S., no-fault divorce became common by the 1970s, meaning couples could split without proving adultery or abuse. Suddenly, infidelity wasn't the only way out of an unhappy marriage, but it was still one of the most painful reasons cited. At the same time, social attitudes shifted. Affairs no longer automatically ruined reputations, at least not everywhere. The sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s challenged traditional ideas of marriage. Some people experimented with open relationships or swinging, insisting that infidelity was only a problem if it was a secret. Of course, that didn't make jealousy disappear. It just gave people new ways to rationalize it. Let's drift back a bit, though, to the early decades of the century. Because one group that got a particularly rough deal were women writers. Many female authors who wrote frankly about love, sex, and affairs were branded scandalous. Take D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, technically by a man, but banned for decades because it depicted a woman's affair openly and sympathetically. When it finally went to trial in the 1960s, the prosecution basically argued that no decent woman would ever be interested in such a book. The defense asked the jury, which included women, whether they agreed. Spoiler, they didn't. The book was acquitted. society shifted a little, and suddenly adultery wasn't just gossip. It was literature. And then, of course, there's the gossip industry itself. By the mid-20th century, tabloids had taken over where medieval pamphlets left off. Papers like Confidential in the 1950s specialized in exposing celebrity affairs. Paparazzi prowled outside nightclubs, hotels, and private estates. Everyone wanted to catch the next big betrayal on camera. It wasn't just the US either. In Britain, the Profumo affair of 1963 rocked the government. John Profumo, the Secretary of State for War, had an affair with Christine Keeler, a 19-year-old model. The twist: Keeler was also involved with a Soviet naval. In the middle of the Cold War, this looked less like romance and more like espionage. When the scandal broke, Profumo resigned. The government was embarrassed, and the press had a feeding frenzy. The Profumo affair is often credited with ushering in a new era of tabloid journalism in Britain, where politicians' private lives were fair game. Meanwhile, in the everyday world, psychology and sociology kept probing at why people cheated. Studies in the 20th century began cataloging reasons: boredom, lack of intimacy, desire for novelty, or just plain opportunity. Some researchers tried to argue that men were naturally wired for infidelity, while women cheated only for emotional reasons. Others pushed back, pointing out that those theories mostly reflected cultural stereotypes. Either way, cheating became something people analyzed in surveys, not just whispered about in confessions. Of course, not everything was serious. Some affairs were almost comedic in their fallout. In Hollywood, for example, there were endless love triangles that played out across magazines. Elizabeth Taylor stealing Eddie Fisher from Debbie Reynolds wasn't unique. The difference was that it played like a soap opera, with fans picking sides, gossip magazines fueling the drama, and everyone somehow surviving with their careers intact. And then there was Richard Burton. He and Elizabeth Taylor began their affair while filming Cleopatra in the 1960s. Both were married to other people at the time. The scandal was so massive that even the Vatican condemned them for erotic vagrancy, which, let's be honest, sounds like the title of a terrible romance novel. Taylor and Burton married, divorced, remarried, and divorced again, proving that sometimes cheating leads not just to heartbreak, but to exhausting paperwork. So, what do we see in the 20th century? The same patterns as always, just with brighter spotlights. Affairs among the rich and powerful made headlines. Ordinary people found it easier to leave marriages, but still carried the stigma. Science poked at the why, tabloids shouted about the who, and society kept pretending to be shocked while secretly fascinated. Let's take a slow breath again. We've glided from Hollywood to Washington, from Paris to London, from Pope novels to paparazzi, and cheating has remained, stubbornly, consistently, a part of human history. Next, we'll float into the modern day, the digital age, where affairs are caught in text messages, exposed on social media, and dissected in real time across the globe. Because if you thought medieval villagers tattling to the priest was bad, wait until Instagram receipts enter the chat. So, here we are, the modern world. Everyone has a smartphone, everyone has an online profile, and suddenly, cheating isn't just a private betrayal, it's public evidence, often saved in the cloud forever. If medieval villagers had to sneak to the priest to complain, today you just check someone's DMS. If the Victorians feared scandalous gossip, today you just scroll through Twitter. Infidelity in the digital age has the same old ingredients: secrecy, desire, boredom. But now it comes with receipts. Literal receipts. Screenshots of flirty texts, emails, dating app messages. Even Uber ride histories sometimes give people away. Technology has made it easier than ever to cheat. and also harder than ever to hide. Let's float first to the world of celebrities, because they continue to be society's favorite case studies in disaster. In the early 2000s, tabloid culture was already relentless. Cheating scandals became staples of glossy magazines and gossip blogs. Think about Brad Pitt, Jennifer Aniston, and Angelina Jolie. The ultimate 2000s triangle. When Brad left Jennifer for Angelina, it was splashed across every magazine rack for years. Team Jen, Team Angelina. People wore the t-shirts. It wasn't just gossip anymore. It was fandom. Then came Tiger Woods. In 2009, his carefully crafted image as the world's most disciplined golfer unraveled in a media storm. His affairs were revealed, one after another, until the story snowballed into dozens of women. Sponsors dropped him, tabloids feasted, and suddenly one of the most private athletes in history was forced to issue a very public apology. A medieval knight might have been scolded by his priest. A Renaissance king might have paid off his mistress, but Tiger Woods had to sit in front of cameras while the world debated his sex life, progress, and then, of course, there's the world of politics, which once again proves that leaders never learn. Take John Edwards, a U.S. presidential candidate in 2008. His affair with a campaign staffer was exposed while his wife was battling cancer. The scandal destroyed his career. What made it worse was the cover-up. Edwards had tried to hide the affair with secret payments and denials, only for everything to unravel in the press. In another century, maybe he could have gotten away with it. In the age of cell phone cameras and instant leaks, no chance. Or consider Anthony Weiner, the congressman who couldn't stop sending inappropriate pictures online. His sexting scandals exploded not once, not twice, but multiple times. Even after resigning from Congress, he tried to make a political comeback, only to be exposed again. Each time, the evidence wasn't rumor or hearsay. It was screenshots, cold, undeniable digital trails. And speaking of digital trails, dating apps changed the game entirely. Tinder, launched in 2012, made casual connections just a swipe away. For some married people, it became an easy avenue for secret affairs. Except, nothing on the internet is ever truly secret. Stories of people being caught on Tinder while in relationships are everywhere. Screenshots get shared, sometimes even going viral. Ashley Madison, the infamous dating site explicitly marketed for affairs, took things even further. Its slogan was literally, "Life is short. Have an affair." Millions signed up, believing their identities would be private, until 2015, when hackers leaked the entire user database online. Suddenly, tens of millions of people's cheating attempts were searchable by name, email, and credit card. Careers collapsed. Marriages imploded. It was basically the medieval pillory, except global, digital, and permanent. Now, let's glide to the ordinary lives that don't make front-page headlines. In the digital age, couples have to navigate new rules. What counts as cheating? Is it only physical, or does sexting count? What about late-night flirty conversations online? What about OnlyFans subscriptions? The boundaries have blurred. Surveys in the 2010s show that many people consider emotional cheating, things like long, secret chats with someone else, just as damaging as physical affairs. Some even see following too many Instagram models as a betrayal. In the past, adultery might have been defined narrowly. Actual sex outside marriage. Today, it's more complicated, and couples argue not just about what happened, but about whether it counts. And of course, technology also makes paranoia easier. Location tracking, shared passwords, read receipts. Relationships now come with constant streams of data. Some couples share everything, others snoop, others set strict boundaries, In a way, cheating in the digital age is both harder to do and harder to prove. Because when everything leaves a trace, everyone becomes a detective. One fascinating angle is how public shaming has returned as a punishment. Remember how medieval villagers might shame a cheater by parading them around with a sign. In the digital age, it's not much different. Scorned partners sometimes blast evidence online, exposing the cheater to family, friends, even strangers. Entire Reddit threads exist just to swap stories of catching someone. TikTok videos go viral with screenshots and receipts. Instead of the church court or the town square, it's the comment section delivering judgment. And the internet, famously, never forgets. Of course, cultural differences still shape how infidelity is treated. In some countries, cheating is a public scandal. In others, it's quietly tolerated. France, for example, has long had a reputation for being more relaxed about affairs among elites. French presidents like François Mitterrand openly maintained mistresses, even having a second family. For years, the press respected this as a private matter. Compare that to the US, where even rumors can sink a politician. Different societies, different rules. But even in France, the digital age changed things. When President François Hollande was photographed sneaking off on a scooter to visit his mistress in 2014, the pictures went viral. Suddenly, the private became global spectacle. So, how do people handle cheating today? In some ways, just like always. Betrayals, heartbreaks, divorces, reconciliations. But the context is different. The stakes are higher because secrets are harder to keep. The exposure is harsher because the internet amplifies everything. And the conversations are messier because modern relationships are negotiating boundaries that didn't exist before. It's also worth noting that some people now actively embrace polyamory, open marriages, and relationship contracts are more visible and discussed than in the past. For these people, cheating isn't defined by having another partner. It's defined by breaking trust or breaking agreed upon rules. So even as society obsesses over affairs, some people are trying to move past the very idea of exclusivity. Whether that actually works smoothly is another question. If we zoom out, the story of cheating hasn't really changed. It's always been about desire colliding with rules, about secrets clashing with expectations. What's shifted is how much evidence is left behind and how much the public gets involved. A medieval king, Middevel, had a hidden mistress. A Victorian husband, Middevel, had a quiet trip to a brothel. Today, someone might just forget to delete their texts. And suddenly, it's not just a private mistake, it's a viral moment. So, as we come to the end of this slow drift, let's reflect. From ancient Rome to Tinder swipes, from public pillories to Reddit threads, from royal scandals to golf legends, people have always struggled with fidelity. Every society sets rules, every society watches some people break them, and every society reacts with a mix of outrage, fascination, and weary acceptance. Cheating has never gone away. It just keeps finding new ways to be messy. Take a slow breath. That's the end of our long, meandering look at how people handled cheating in history. From stone tablets to text messages, from church courts to internet forums, humans, it seems, are consistent. Thanks for drifting along tonight. Until next time, sleep well.